The rifle shot echoed through the canyon at dawn, and Fiona Kendrick knew immediately that someone was trying to scare her off her land again. She stood on the porch of her small cabin, her hands trembling as she gripped the wooden railing, watching the dust settle where the bullet had struck a fence post 20 yards away. This was the third warning in as many weeks, and her resolve was beginning to crack under the pressure. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red rock landscape of southern Utah, painting the cliffs in shades of crimson and gold that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. She had come to St. George, Utah in the spring of 1883 with nothing but a land grant her late father had purchased before his death, and a determination to make something of herself. At 23 years old, Fiona had left behind the confines of Boston society and the suffocating expectations of becoming some merchant's dutiful wife. Her father had believed in her dream of independence, and his final gift had been 160 acres of Utah territory where she could build a new life. The land was harsh but beautiful, with a creek running through the property that made it valuable for cattle or crops. She had filed her claim at the land office in town, paid her fees, and begun the back-breaking work of building a home and clearing fields. But 2 months ago, everything had changed. A man named Silas Turnbull had arrived at her door with documents claiming that her land grant was fraudulent, that the property actually belonged to a cattle baron from Nevada who wanted to expand his holdings. Turnbull was the territorial land agent, a thin man with oiled hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He had been polite at first, suggesting she simply abandon her claim and move on before things became unpleasant. When she refused and showed him her father's legitimate papers, he had laughed and told her that her documents would not stand up against the official records in his office. Fiona had gone to the sheriff, but the lawman had been sympathetic yet unhelpful. Land disputes were civil matters, he explained, to be settled in courts that could take years to reach a verdict. She had consulted with the town's only lawyer, an elderly man who had looked over her papers and told her they appeared legitimate, but without access to the territorial records in Salt Lake City, he could not prove the forgery. The legal fees alone would bankrupt her, and Turnbull knew it. So the harassment had begun, the threats, and now the gunshots. She went inside and bolted the door, her heart pounding. She had tried to be strong, tried to stand her ground, but she was alone out here with no family and few friends in this harsh territory. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away in the town of St. George was a 2-hour wagon ride across difficult terrain. She sank into a chair at her rough-hewn table and put her head in her hands, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. She would not cry. She would not give Turnbull the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. A knock at the door made her jump. She grabbed the shotgun she kept loaded by the fireplace and approached cautiously. "Miss Kendrick? My name is Xander Oakes. Your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, asked me to check on you." The voice was deep and calm, with a roughness that spoke of years spent outdoors. Fiona hesitated, then cracked the door open, keeping the shotgun visible. The man standing on her porch was unlike anyone she had seen in St. George. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against a worn buckskin shirt. His arms were thick with muscle, and his hands looked like they could snap a tree branch without effort. Dark hair fell past his collar, slightly unkempt but clean, and his face was weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw covered in several days of stubble. His eyes were a startling blue-gray like storm clouds over the mountains, and they regarded her with a directness that was neither threatening nor presumptuous. "Mrs. Patterson sent you?" Fiona asked, lowering the shotgun slightly, but not entirely. "She mentioned you were having trouble with someone trying to force you off your land. I have some experience with that kind of situation." His gaze moved past her to the fence post with the fresh bullet hole. "Looks like the trouble is getting worse. What business is it of yours?" She did not mean to sound harsh, but fear and exhaustion had stripped away her social niceties. "None, I suppose, except that I do not care for men who threaten women." He pulled back his jacket slightly to show a deputy marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "I am also a federal officer and land fraud falls under my jurisdiction. Mrs. Patterson thought I might be able to help." Fiona felt something loosen in her chest, a tiny spark of hope after weeks of despair. She opened the door wider. "Please come in." Xander Oakes had to duck slightly to enter her small cabin. He seemed to fill the entire space with his presence, making her acutely aware of how isolated she had been. He removed his hat, revealing more of his weathered face and those penetrating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He glanced around the cabin, taking in the neat but sparse furnishings, the stack of legal documents on her table, and the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Tell me everything," he said, settling his large frame carefully into one of her chairs. Fiona poured them both coffee from the pot on the stove and began her story. She told him about her father's death, the land grant he had purchased through legitimate channels, her journey west and her arrival in St. George. She described filing her claim with Silas Turnbull and the initial approval she had received. Then she explained how Turnbull had returned with forged documents claiming her grant was invalid, how the harassment had escalated, and how she felt trapped with no way to prove her case. Xander listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he asked to see her papers. She spread them on the table, and he examined each document carefully. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he handled the pages, despite their size and obvious strength. "These look legitimate to me," he said finally. "The seals are correct, the signatures appear genuine, and the land description matches the legal survey records I have seen." "What did Turnbull's documents look like?" "He only showed them to me briefly. They claimed the land had been granted to someone else 6 months before my father's purchase, which would make my grant invalid." Fiona wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking its warmth despite the growing heat of the day. "But my father was meticulous about such things. He would never have purchased land without verifying the title was clear." "Did Turnbull leave copies of his documents with you?" "No. He said they were official territorial records and could not leave his office." Xander's jaw tightened. "That is convenient for him. In my experience, legitimate land agents are happy to provide copies of official records. The fact that he refused is suspicious." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "I have been tracking Turnbull for several months. There have been reports of similar situations in other territories, always involving valuable land and vulnerable claim holders. Women alone, elderly settlers, immigrants who do not speak English well. He targets people who cannot easily fight back. Why has no one stopped him? Because he is clever. He moves between territories, works with local corrupt officials, and by the time anyone realizes what has happened, he has moved on. The only way to prove fraud definitively is to access the original land office records in the territorial capital and compare them to what he is showing his victims. But that requires a marshal with jurisdiction and authority to demand those records." He smiled slightly, and Fiona felt her breath catch at how it transformed his stern features. "Which is where I come in. You would do that. Go all the way to Salt Lake City for me?" "I would go to prove Turnbull is a criminal and to protect you. Land fraud is a federal crime, Miss Kendrick, and I take my job seriously." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there beyond professional duty, a warmth that made her pulse quicken. "Besides, Mrs. Patterson spoke very highly of you. She said you were one of the bravest women she had ever met, coming out here alone to build a new life. I admire courage." Fiona felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was not accustomed to such direct compliments, especially not from a man who looked like he could wrestle bears and win. "When would you leave?" "Tomorrow at first light. It is a hard ride to Salt Lake City, about 300 miles north through rough country. I will need to push hard to get there and back quickly. While I am gone, I want you to stay in town with Mrs. Patterson. You will be safer there than out here alone. This is my land. I will not abandon it. It is not abandoning it to protect yourself while I gather the evidence to save your claim." His voice was firm but not unkind. "If something happens to you, Turnbull wins regardless. Be practical, not stubborn." She wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. The shooting this morning had terrified her more than she wanted to admit. "How long will you be gone?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending on weather and what I find." "Can you hold on that long?" "I have held on this long." She met his eyes with determination. "I can manage a few more weeks." "Good." He stood, his full height making her feel small and strangely protected. "Pack what you need for an extended stay in town. I will escort you to Mrs. Patterson's house this afternoon, and then I will have a conversation with Mr. Turnbull before I leave. I want him to know that you are under federal protection now." The thought of Xander Oakes confronting Turnbull on her behalf sent a thrill through her that was equal parts relief, and something else she did not want to examine too closely. She had been alone for so long, fighting this battle by herself, and now this powerful man had appeared like something out of a legend, ready to ride to her defense. It seemed too good to be true. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked quietly. "You said you have been tracking Turnbull, but there must be other cases, other victims. Why come all the way out here for me?" Xander paused at the door, his hand on the frame. When he turned back, his expression was serious. "Because Mrs. Patterson told me about a young woman who crossed half a continent alone to claim land her father believed in, who has worked herself to exhaustion trying to build something decent in hard country, and who refuses to be intimidated by a corrupt land agent and his hired guns. That kind of spirit is rare, Miss Kendrick. It deserves protection." He settled his hat back on his head. And because the moment I saw you standing in that doorway with your shotgun, refusing to be afraid even though you were terrified, I knew you were someone worth fighting for. He was gone before she could respond, striding across her yard with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own strength. Fiona stood in the doorway, watching him disappear down the trail toward town, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt hope, and something more, something that made her heart beat faster and her skin feel warm despite the morning breeze. She spent the rest of the morning packing a bag for her stay in town, trying not to think too much about Xander Oakes or the way his presence had filled her small cabin with a sense of safety she had not felt since her father died. She told herself it was simply gratitude, relief that someone with authority was finally taking her situation seriously. But she could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at her, the quiet intensity in his storm-colored eyes, or the strength in his hands as he had carefully examined her documents. By early afternoon, Xander returned with a sturdy horse for her to ride. He had changed into clean clothes, though they were still the practical buckskin and denim of a man who lived in the wilderness. His horse was a massive roan gelding that looked like it could carry him through any terrain without complaint. He helped her secure her bag behind her saddle, his hand steadying her when she mounted, and the brief contact sent electricity through her arm. They rode toward St. George in companionable silence at first. The red rock landscape stretched around them in dramatic formations, buttes and mesas rising against the brilliant blue sky. The desert was in bloom with the recent spring rains, splashing color across the sage and sand. Fiona had grown to love this harsh country despite everything, its wild beauty and open spaces so different from the cramped streets of Boston. "How long have you been a marshal?" she asked as they followed the winding trail through a narrow canyon. 7 years officially, but I have been living in these mountains most of my life. I grew up in Colorado Territory, learned to track and hunt from the Ute people who lived near our settlement. When I was old enough, I started guiding wagon trains and working as a scout. Got recruited by the Marshal Service because they needed men who knew the backcountry and could handle themselves in difficult situations. He glanced at her with a hint of amusement. "I suppose I fit the requirements." "I would say so." The words came out more flirtatious than she intended, and she felt her cheeks flush. "I mean, you certainly look capable." "Capable," he chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that made her smile despite her embarrassment. "My mother would say I look like I was raised by wolves, but I appreciate your diplomacy. Your mother is still living?" His expression softened. "She passed 5 years ago. Pneumonia one winter. My father went a year later. I think he just missed her too much to keep fighting." There was old grief in his voice, but also acceptance. "They had 40 good years together, though. That is more than many people get. I am sorry for your loss. I lost my father just last year. My mother died when I was a child, so it was always just the two of us. I miss him terribly." "Is that why you came west? To escape the memories?" "Partly, but also to honor his dream. He always talked about the frontier, about the opportunities for people willing to work hard and build something new. He bought this land for both of us, planning to come west when he retired from his business. But his heart gave out before he could see it, so I came instead." She looked out at the dramatic landscape around them. "I think he would have loved it here. He gave you a great gift, teaching you to be brave enough to chase dreams. Not many fathers would encourage their daughters to strike out on their own like this. He believed women were just as capable as men given the chance. It was an unusual opinion in Boston society. I think that is part of why I loved him so much." They emerged from the canyon onto a broader trail, and St. George came into view in the valley below, a small collection of buildings clustered near the Virgin River. The town had been founded by Mormon settlers 20 years earlier, and had grown into a modest community serving the surrounding ranches and farms. Adobe and stone buildings lined the main street, and green fields contrasted with the red rock desert that pressed in from all sides. Xander led her to a tidy house on the edge of town where Mrs. Patterson lived with her adult son and his family. The older woman came out to greet them, her round face creased with worry that eased when she saw Fiona was safe. "Thank heavens, child. I heard there was shooting out at your place this morning. I sent word to Marshal Oakes as soon as I learned he was passing through the territory." She embraced Fiona warmly. "You will stay here as long as necessary. We have plenty of room." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I do not know what I would do without your kindness." "Nonsense. We women have to look after each other out here." She turned shrewd eyes on Xander. "And thank you, Marshal, for taking an interest in Miss Kendrick's situation. It is about time someone dealt with that snake Turnbull." "I plan to do exactly that, madam. But first, I need to make sure Miss Kendrick is safe and settled." Then I have some business to attend to before I ride north." After ensuring Fiona was comfortable in the small but clean room Mrs. Patterson provided, Xander prepared to leave. He stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking most of the afternoon light, and Fiona felt a sudden reluctance to see him go. "Be careful," she said. "Turnbull might be dangerous. I have dealt with worse." But his expression was serious. "You be careful too. Stay in town, stay with people, and do not go anywhere alone. I do not trust Turnbull or whoever he has working for him. When will you leave for Salt Lake City?" "Dawn tomorrow. I want to confront Turnbull first. Let him know you are under federal protection and any further harassment will result in his immediate arrest. It might make him nervous enough to make a mistake." He reached out and gently touched her arm, his hand warm and solid. "I will be back as soon as I can, and I will bring the proof you need to keep your land. I believe you." And she did, with an intensity that surprised her. She barely knew this man, yet something in his steady gaze and quiet strength made her trust him completely. He smiled, that transformative expression that made her heart flutter, and then he was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden walkway outside. Fiona watched from the window as he mounted his big roan horse and rode toward the center of town, toward the land office where Silas Turnbull conducted his fraudulent business. She pressed her hand against the window glass, already missing his presence, already counting the days until he would return. Mrs. Patterson appeared beside her, following her gaze with knowing eyes. "He is a good man, that one. Rare to find in these parts. He is just doing his job." "Is that what you tell yourself?" The older woman chuckled. "I saw how he looked at you, child, and how you looked at him. Nothing wrong with that, mind you. You have been alone too long, fighting too hard. It is about time someone strong enough to match you came along." Fiona did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. But as she watched Xander disappear into the heart of St. George, she could not deny the truth in Mrs. Patterson's words. Something had shifted between them in the brief hours they had spent together. Something that felt like the beginning of something much larger than either of them had anticipated. Xander found Silas Turnbull in the land office, a small building near the courthouse that smelled of old paper and corruption. Turnbull looked up from his desk when Xander entered, and his oiled smile faltered when he took in the marshal's badge and the hard expression on Xander's face. "Marshal, what can I do for you?" Turnbull's voice was smooth, practiced at Deceptsrippage. "You can stop harassing Miss Fiona Kendrick and attempting to steal her land through fraud." Xander did not bother with pleasantries. He stepped closer to the desk, using his size to intimidate. "I am making her case a federal investigation as of now. Any further threats, any more gunshots, any contact with her whatsoever, and I will arrest you for attempted land fraud and have you in a territorial prison so fast your head will spin." Turnbull's smile tightened. "I do not know what Miss Kendrick has told you, but she is the one with fraudulent documents. I have the official territorial records showing her claim is invalid. Then you will have no problem producing those records for my inspection when I return from Salt Lake City." Xander leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "I am riding to the territorial capital to examine the original land grant records. If I find even the slightest evidence that you have been forging documents or manipulating the system, I will not only arrest you, I will make sure every other case you have handled gets reviewed. How many other people have you cheated, Turnbull? How many families have you driven off their land?" The land agent's face paled, but he maintained his composure. "You have no authority to threaten me. I have every authority. I am a federal marshal investigating land fraud in the territories. You answer to me now." Xander straightened to his full height, towering over the smaller man. "Stay away from Miss Kendrick. Stay away from her property. And pray that I do not find what I expect to find in Salt Lake City, because if I do, your career is over and your freedom is forfeit." He turned and strode out of the office without waiting for a response. Behind him he heard Turnbull cursing, the sound of papers being shuffled frantically. Good. Let the man sweat. Let him make mistakes. Corrupt men always did when they felt the walls closing in. Xander spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for his journey north. He purchased supplies, checked his weapons, and made arrangements with the local sheriff to keep an eye on Fiona while he was gone. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Carson, was sympathetic but resigned. "I have suspected Turnbull of crooked dealing for months, but without proof my hands are tied. Land disputes are civil matters unless you can prove criminal fraud." He shook Xander's hand firmly. "Bring back that proof, Marshal, and I will be happy to clap that snake in irons. That is my plan." Xander mounted his horse and took one last look at the house where Fiona was staying. He could see her silhouette in the window, and something in his chest tightened at the thought of leaving her, even temporarily. He had meant what he said about her spirit being rare and worth fighting for. But there was more to it than professional duty or admiration for her courage. From the moment he had seen her standing in that cabin doorway, defiant despite her fear, something had stirred in him that he had not felt in years, maybe ever. He had lived a solitary life in the mountains, content with his work and his freedom, never feeling the need for more. But Fiona Kendrick, with her green eyes and determined chin and quiet strength, had awakened something he thought he had buried long ago. The desire for companionship, for partnership, for someone to build a life with instead of just surviving alone. He was getting ahead of himself. She was a job, a citizen who needed his protection and his skills. Once he cleared her name and secured her land, she would go on with her life and he would return to his. That was how it worked. He was a mountain man, a wanderer, not the kind of man who settled down with a proper Boston-bred lady, no matter how brave she was or how her smile made his heart pound. But as he rode out of St. George into the gathering dusk, heading toward the high country and the long road to Salt Lake City, he could not shake the image of Fiona from his mind, or the growing certainty that this job was going to change his life in ways he had never anticipated. The journey to Salt Lake City took Xander 11 hard days of riding through some of the most challenging terrain in the territory. He pushed north through the high desert, climbing into the mountains where spring snowmelt still ran in icy streams, and the nights dropped below freezing. His big roan horse, named Thunder for his powerful gait, carried him tirelessly through long days that started before dawn and ended long after dark. Xander used the solitary hours to think about Fiona, about her case and about what he might find in the territorial capital. He had seen land fraud before, had broken up schemes that displaced dozens of families. But something about Turnbull's operation bothered him more than usual. The man was too confident, too brazen in his methods. That suggested either powerful backing or a network of corruption that reached higher than a simple land agent should be able to manage. He also thought about the way Fiona had looked at him when he promised to help her, the trust and hope in her eyes. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone depend on him for more than just a guide through the mountains or protection on a dangerous trail. Fiona needed him in a way that made him want to be better, stronger, more worthy of that trust. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. On the 6th day, he reached the small settlement of Fillmore and stopped to rest Thunder and resupply. The town was quiet, just a handful of buildings serving travelers on the main road north. He was sitting in the small cafe eating a hot meal when a man approached his table, someone he recognized from previous work in the territory. Marshal Oakes? Tom Henderson. We met 2 years ago when you were tracking those cattle rustlers through Sanpete County. Xander shook the man's hand. Henderson was a land surveyor, honest and knowledgeable. I remember, you testified at their trial. What brings you to Fillmore? Work, same as always. Mapping claims for new settlers. Henderson hesitated, then lowered his voice. I heard you are investigating land fraud cases. Is that true? It might be. Why do you ask? Because I have been seeing some irregularities in land office records over the past year. Nothing I could prove, but surveys that do not match the official plats, grants that overlap in ways that should not be possible. I reported it to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, but nothing ever came of it. He glanced around to make sure they were not overheard. There was one name that kept appearing in these problematic cases, a land agent named Silas Turnbull. Xander leaned forward, his interest sharp. What kind of irregularities? Altered boundaries, backdated grants, falsified signatures on transfer documents. All small enough that individual settlers would not notice, but together they add up to thousands of acres being transferred from legitimate owners to a consortium of investors. I think Turnbull has been running a systematic fraud operation across multiple territories, stealing land from vulnerable people and selling it to wealthy buyers who do not ask questions about the provenance. Henderson pulled out a worn notebook. I have been keeping records of every suspicious case I encounter. It is not enough for a legal case, but it might help you know what to look for in the official records. Xander studied the notebook, seeing a pattern of fraud that went back at least 3 years and spread across Utah, Nevada, and Arizona territories. Fiona's case was just the most recent in a long line of victims. Anger burned in his chest at the scale of the corruption. Can I take this notebook with me to Salt Lake City? That is why I showed it to you. Someone needs to stop Turnbull before he destroys more lives. Henderson stood, preparing to leave. Be careful, Marshal. Men who can run an operation this big for this long have powerful friends. You are going to make dangerous enemies. I have made dangerous enemies before. But Xander appreciated the warning. This was bigger than he had initially thought. which meant he needed to be more careful about gathering ironclad evidence. He reached Salt Lake City on the 11th day, tired and trail-worn but driven by urgency. The territorial capital was a bustling city by frontier standards, with wide streets and substantial buildings that reflected the organized planning of its Mormon founders. The land office was housed in an impressive stone structure near the territorial capitol building. Xander presented his credentials to the clerk, a nervous young man, who stammered when he saw the federal marshal's badge. "I need to examine the original land grant records for properties in Washington County, specifically in the St. George area, dating from 1882 to the present." "That is highly irregular, Marshal. We do not typically allow access to the original records without a court order." Xander leaned over the counter, using his size and authority to make his point. "I am conducting a federal investigation into land fraud. I have the authority to examine any territorial records relevant to my case. You can cooperate now, or I can arrest you for obstruction of justice and get the records anyway. Your choice." The clerk paled and hurried to comply. Within an hour, Xander was seated at a large table in the records room, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers and file boxes containing the original land grants for Washington County. He started with the property Fiona claimed, tracing its history through the official records. What he found made his blood boil. The original grant had indeed been issued to Fiona's father, Jonas Kendrick, in April 1882, exactly as her documents showed. The title was clear, properly recorded, with all fees paid and all procedures followed correctly. There was no prior claim, no overlapping grant, nothing that would invalidate Fiona's ownership. But there was a second set of documents in the file, clumsily inserted, that claimed the same land had been granted to a Nevada cattle company 6 months earlier. These documents were obvious forgeries. The paper was newer, the ink a slightly different shade, and the signatures did not match the authenticated examples in the territorial seal book. Most damning, the survey coordinates were slightly wrong, describing land half a mile from Fiona's actual property. Turnbull had not even been careful in his fraud. He had relied on his victims being unable to access these records and the local officials being too intimidated or corrupt to question his authority. It was brazen and stupid, which made Xander wonder again about who was backing the land agent and giving him the confidence to be so sloppy. He spent 3 more days in Salt Lake City, methodically going through every case in Henderson's notebook and photographing the forged documents with a camera he borrowed from the Territorial Surveyor's Office. The evidence was overwhelming. Turnbull had forged dozens of land grants, displaced hundreds of settlers, and stolen thousands of acres of valuable property. The fraud stretched back years and involved multiple accomplices in various land offices throughout the territories. Xander also discovered who was buying the stolen land. A consortium of investors led by a wealthy railroad magnate who wanted to assemble a massive cattle and mining empire across the Southwest. The magnate probably had no idea the land titles were fraudulent, but Turnbull and his network of corrupt agents had been systematically feeding him properties at bargain prices, pocketing hefty commissions in the process. With the evidence secured and properly documented, Xander met with the Territorial Attorney General and presented his findings. The Attorney General, a stern man named Morrison, reviewed the materials with growing outrage. "This is the most extensive land fraud case I have seen in 20 years of practice. How did Turnbull think he could get away with this? Because he targeted people who could not easily fight back and moved between territories to stay ahead of any investigation. If I had not been tracking him specifically, he might have continued indefinitely." Xander organized the photographs and affidavits into a neat stack. "I need warrants for Turnbull's arrest and the seizure of all his records. I also need authorization to review every land transaction he has handled in the past 5 years. You will have them within the hour." Morrison shook his head in disgust. "That poor woman in St. George and all the others he victimized. At least we can make this right now." Xander left the Attorney General's office with a leather satchel full of legal documents, official affidavits, and photographic evidence that would destroy Turnbull's operation and restore Fiona's land claim beyond any doubt. He also had arrest warrants for Turnbull and 3 other land agents who had been part of the fraud network. The ride back to St. George took 10 days because he pushed Thunder even harder than on the journey north. Driven by urgency to get back to Fiona and an aching need to see her again that had nothing to do with his professional duties. He had been thinking about her constantly during his time in Salt Lake City, remembering the determined set of her jaw and the vulnerability in her eyes, the way she had trusted him to help her when she had every reason to trust no one. He had also been thinking about what might happen after this case was resolved. Once Fiona's claim was secured and Turnbull was arrested, Xander would have no official reason to stay in St. George. He would receive his next assignment and move on to another case in another territory, back to his solitary life in the mountains. The thought left him hollow in a way he had never experienced before. Somewhere during the long rides and cold nights alone with his thoughts, Xander had admitted to himself that what he felt for Fiona Kendrick was not just admiration or professional concern. He was falling in love with her courage and her stubbornness and her refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have defeated most people. He loved the way she looked at him like he was someone worth believing in, and the way her rare smiles transformed her face from merely pretty to absolutely beautiful. But what could he offer her? He was a mountain man who lived rough, a federal marshal whose work took him into dangerous situations in remote locations. Fiona deserved stability, a home, someone who would be there every day to help her build the life she had come west to create. He could give her justice and protection, but could he give her the kind of future she needed? These thoughts plagued him as thunder carried him through the high country and down into the red rock desert of southern Utah. By the time he saw the familiar landmarks approaching St. George, he had made a decision that terrified him but felt more right than anything in his life. He would tell Fiona the truth about his feelings and see if maybe, just maybe, she felt the same way. And if she did, he would find a way to make it work, to build a life that could include both his work and a future with her. He reached St. George on a warm afternoon in early May, the town bustling with activity as spring planting season reached its peak. He rode straight to Mrs. Patterson's house, his heart pounding harder than it had during any gunfight or dangerous arrest. The older woman was working in her garden and straightened with a broad smile when she saw him. "Marshal Oakes, thank the Lord you are back safe. Miss Kendrick has been beside herself with worry, though she tried to hide it. Is she here?" "Inside, helping with the baking." "Go on in. You look like you have been through hell and back." Xander dismounted and strode to the door, suddenly uncertain despite all his resolution on the trail. What if he had misread the situation? What if Fiona saw him only as a marshal doing his job, and his feelings were his alone? He knocked and heard quick footsteps inside. Then the door opened and Fiona was there, flour dusting her cheek and her hair tied back in a simple braid. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and the expression on her face, joy and relief and something warmer, something that looked like longing, answered all his questions. Xander. His name came out as a breath, and then she was in his arms, having crossed the distance between them without conscious thought. He held her, acutely aware of how perfectly she fit against his chest despite their difference in size, how right it felt to have her there. "I found the proof," he said into her hair, which smelled like sunshine and bread. "Your claim is legitimate, and I have enough evidence to arrest Turnbull and dismantle his entire operation." "Your land is safe, Fiona. You won." She pulled back to look up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. I do not have words to thank you enough. You saved everything I came here for. You saved it yourself by refusing to give up." He brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch gentle despite his rough hands. "I just provided the proof." They stood there in the doorway, her in his arms and his heart hammering, aware that they had crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. Mrs. Patterson discreetly vanished deeper into the house, leaving them alone in the front room. "I missed you," Fiona whispered. "I tried to tell myself it was just because I was worried about the case, but that was not true. I missed you, Xander. These 3 weeks felt like 3 years. I missed you too. Every day, every mile I thought about you, about coming back to you." He took a breath, knowing he had to say this now before his courage failed. "I have spent my whole adult life alone, Fiona. I thought that was what I wanted, what I needed. But then I met you, and everything changed. I do not know how to do this, how to be what you need, but I want to try if you will let me." Her smile was radiant, transforming her whole face with joy. "Are you saying what I think you are saying? I am saying I am falling in love with you. I am saying I want a chance to see where this goes between us. I am saying that I have spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself that I should just do my job and move on, but I cannot imagine moving on without you." The words tumbled out, clumsy and earnest. "I know I am just a rough mountain man and you are an educated lady from Boston." But she stopped him with a kiss, standing on her toes to reach his mouth, her hands clutching his jacket. The kiss was sweet and tentative and perfect, tasting of flower and hope and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she was laughing through her tears. "You are not just anything, Xander Oakes. You are the man who rode 300 miles to save my land, who believed me when no one else would, who made me feel safe for the first time since I came west. You are kind and strong and honorable, and I started falling in love with you the moment you stood in my doorway and offered to help." She cupped his weathered face in her small hands. So yes, I want to see where this goes. Yes, I want to try. Yes to everything. He kissed her again, deeper this time, wrapping his arms around her and lifting her off her feet. When he set her down, they were both smiling like fools, giddy with the realization that they had found something rare and precious in this harsh territory. I have to arrest Turnbull and settle the legal matters, Xander said reluctantly. That will take a few days. But after that, if you want me to, I could help you rebuild your place. I am handy with tools and I know something about ranching and farming. I would like that very much. Fiona laced her fingers through his. I would like that more than anything. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, Xander explaining everything he had found in Salt Lake City, while Fiona listened with growing amazement at the scope of Turnbull's fraud. She asked intelligent questions about the legal process and what would happen next, and Xander found himself delighting in her quick mind and the way she grasped the complexities of the case immediately. That evening, over dinner with Mrs. Patterson's family, they told the older woman about their budding relationship. Mrs. Patterson beamed and declared she had known from the moment she sent for the marshal that something special would come of it. You two are perfect for each other, she said, patting Fiona's hand. Both stubborn, both brave, both too foolish to know when to quit. You will have a fine life together if you do not kill each other first. Everyone laughed, and Xander felt something settle in his chest, a contentment he had never experienced. This was what home felt like, he realized. Not a place, but people who cared about you, who welcomed you into their circle, who made you part of something larger than yourself. The next morning, Xander rode to the land office with Sheriff Carson and 2 deputies. They found Silas Turnbull packing papers into a trunk, clearly preparing to flee. When he saw the marshal and the arrest warrant, his oiled composure cracked. You cannot prove anything, he blustered, but his voice shook. I have photographic evidence of forged land grants, affidavits from the Territorial Attorney General, and documented proof that you have been running a systematic fraud operation for at least 3 years. Xander's voice was cold and hard. Silas Turnbull, you are under arrest for land fraud, forgery, conspiracy to defraud the territorial government, and about 24 other charges that will keep you in prison for the rest of your natural life. Turnbull lunged for a pistol in his desk drawer, but Xander was faster, his big hand clamping down on the land agent's wrist with crushing force. The gun clattered to the floor and Sheriff Carson moved in with handcuffs. Do not make this worse for yourself, Xander advised. You are already looking at 20 years minimum. Add assaulting a federal officer, and you will die in prison. The fight went out of Turnbull. He slumped in defeat as the deputies led him away. Xander and Sheriff Carson spent the rest of the day cataloging the evidence in Turnbull's office, finding more forged documents and a ledger that detailed payoffs to corrupt officials in 3 territories. It was a treasure trove of evidence that would lead to dozens more arrests and the recovery of stolen land for hundreds of victims. By evening, the news had spread through St. George that Turnbull had been arrested, and Miss Kendrick's land claim had been vindicated. Fiona arrived at the land office with Mrs. Patterson just as Xander was finishing his work, and he handed her a stack of official documents. These are certified copies of your legitimate land grant, signed by the Territorial Attorney General. Your ownership is now a matter of permanent public record. No one can ever question your claim again. He smiled at her shining eyes. You can go home, Fiona, to your land, your future, everything you worked for. She threw her arms around him right there in front of the sheriff and deputies and Mrs. Patterson, kissing him soundly while everyone cheered. When they finally broke apart, both laughing, Xander felt like the luckiest man in all the territories. True to his word, Xander spent the next several weeks helping Fiona rebuild and improve her property. He was as skilled with tools as he was with tracking and investigation, and under his guidance, they repaired her cabin, reinforced the fences, cleared more land for planting, and even started construction on a small barn. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and Fiona marveled at how easily they fell into partnership, how naturally they moved around each other, anticipating needs and sharing the labor. Xander also proved to be surprisingly gentle and attentive when they were not working. He brought her wildflowers he found in the canyon, cooked meals over her fireplace when she was too tired to stand, and sat with her in the evenings on the porch, watching the sunset paint the red rocks in impossible colors. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, their lives before they met, their hopes for the future, the peculiar beauty of the desert landscape around them. Their first real kiss, after that initial impulsive one in Mrs. Patterson's house, came on one of those evenings after a particularly long day of working on the barn. They were sitting close together on the porch steps, shoulders touching, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Fiona had been acutely aware all day of Xander's strength as he lifted heavy beams, the flex of muscles under his shirt, the competent way his hands handled every task. She had found herself distracted more than once, admiring him when she should have been working. "You are staring at me," he said softly, amusement in his voice. "I am. You are worth staring at." She was past pretending or hiding her feelings. Life was too short and too hard in this territory to waste time on coyness. He turned to face her, his storm-gray eyes searching hers in the fading light. "Fiona, I need you to know something. I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. It scares me sometimes. How much I want this to work, how much I need you. I feel the same way. It is terrifying and wonderful at the same time." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "But I am not afraid of it anymore. I am not afraid of anything when you are with me." He kissed her then, slowly and thoroughly, his large hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. The kiss deepened, and Fiona felt heat bloom through her body, a longing that was both new and ancient. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Fiona Kendrick. I want to spend my life with you, building this ranch, facing whatever challenges come, growing old together in this wild country we both love. I love you too, Xander Oakes. More than I knew it was possible to love someone." She smiled against his mouth. "Is this your way of asking me to marry you? I suppose it is. Though I am doing a poor job of it. I do not have a ring, I did not plan any grand gesture. I am just a rough man with dirt under his fingernails asking if you would consider spending your life with him." "Yes, 1,000 times yes." She kissed him again, joy bubbling up inside her until she thought she might burst from it. "I came west looking for land and independence, but I found so much more. I found home. I found you." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the Mormon church in St. George, with Mrs. Patterson and her family, Sheriff Carson, and a handful of neighbors who had befriended Fiona attending. Fiona wore a simple white dress she and Mrs. Patterson had sewn together, with wildflowers in her hair. Xander had gotten a haircut and wore new clothes, looking uncomfortable in the formal attire but breathtakingly handsome. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges the frontier might bring, Fiona felt tears streaming down her face. She had come to Utah Territory alone and frightened, with nothing but a questionable land claim and desperate courage. Now she stood beside a man who loved her fiercely, surrounded by friends who had become family, about to begin a life beyond anything she had imagined when she left Boston. Xander slipped a simple gold band on her finger, one he had ridden to the nearest jeweler in Cedar City to purchase. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, he swept her into his arms and kissed her soundly, to the cheers and applause of their guests. They held a celebration at Fiona's ranch, their ranch now, with tables set up outside laden with food that everyone had contributed. There was music and dancing, and Fiona laughed as Xander swung her around in clumsy circles, admitting he had never learned to dance properly but would try for her. "You are perfect exactly as you are," she told him, standing on her toes to kiss him while their guests whistled and hooted. "I would not change a single thing." As the sun set and the party wound down, they stood together looking out at their land, the red rock cliffs glowing in the last light of day. Xander wrapped his arms around Fiona from behind, and she leaned back against his solid chest, feeling safe and loved and home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "About how this was supposed to be my father's dream, but it became mine. And how I almost lost it to a corrupt land agent and his forged papers. And how you rode 300 miles through mountains and desert to save it for me, and ended up saving me too." She turned in his arms to face him. "I am thinking about how grateful I am for every difficult thing that led me here, because it brought me to you. I am the one who is grateful. You made me believe I could have more than a lonely life in the mountains. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something permanent." He kissed her forehead gently. "You gave me a future, Fiona. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not know how to tell you he loved you. You told me perfectly, and you show me every day in everything you do." She smiled up at him. "Now come inside, husband. It is our wedding night, and I have plans for you." His eyes darkened with desire and love, and he swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold of their cabin, while she laughed and protested that she could walk perfectly well. But she did not really protest, content to be held by this strong, gentle man who had become her whole world. The territorial trial of Silas Turnbull and his co-conspirators took place 6 months later in Salt Lake City. Xander and Fiona traveled north together, this time taking their time and enjoying the journey. Xander showed her parts of the territory she had never seen, the high mountain meadows where elk grazed and wildflowers bloomed in profusion, hidden waterfalls and ancient cliff dwellings left by people who had lived in these lands long before any white settlers arrived. At the trial, Fiona testified about her experience with Turnbull's fraud attempt, her voice clear and steady as she described the harassment and threats she had endured. Xander presented the overwhelming documentary evidence, and the Territorial Attorney General prosecuted the case with vigor. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the verdict was never in doubt. Turnbull and his accomplices were convicted on all counts and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. More importantly, the case led to comprehensive reforms in how land grants were recorded and verified throughout the Western Territories. The Territorial Land Commissioner implemented new safeguards to prevent fraud, and dozens of families who had been displaced by Turnbull's schemes had their legitimate claims restored. Xander received commendations from both the territorial government and the Federal Marshal Service for his work on the case. But the professional accolades mattered less to him than the personal victory. He had saved Fiona's land and in the process found a life worth living beyond his solitary wandering. When they returned to their ranch in St. George after the trial, he realized he had never been happier. Life settled into a rhythm over the following years. Xander continued to work as a federal marshal but took assignments only in the Utah and Arizona territories, so he could stay close to home. He would ride out for a few weeks at a time tracking outlaws or investigating crimes, then return to the ranch and Fiona, who always greeted him with fierce kisses and grateful tears that he had come back safe. Fiona proved to be as capable a rancher as she was stubborn. She expanded their holdings gradually, purchasing adjoining land when it became available, and built a profitable operation raising cattle and horses suited to the harsh desert climate. She also became known throughout the territory as an advocate for land reform and women's property rights, testifying before the territorial legislature and corresponding with reformers in Washington about the need for better protections for settlers. Their first child, a daughter they named Grace after Xander's mother, was born in the spring of 1885. Xander had been terrified during Fiona's pregnancy, pacing outside while the midwife attended her, convinced something would go wrong. But when he finally held his tiny daughter in his massive hands, tears streaming down his weathered face, he fell in love all over again. Fiona, exhausted but radiant, had laughed at his odd expression. "She has your eyes," she said softly, "storm gray like her father." "But your courage," Xander replied, touching Grace's tiny fingers. "She already has a grip like iron." Grace was followed 2 years later by a son they named Jonas after Fiona's father, and then another daughter, Rose, 2 years after that. Their cabin expanded into a proper house with extra bedrooms and a wide porch where they spent evenings as a family. Xander telling stories about his adventures in the mountains while the children listened with wide eyes, and Fiona mended clothes or worked on her correspondence with land reform activists across the country. Mrs. Patterson remained a constant presence in their lives, becoming a beloved grandmother figure to their children. She lived to the impressive age of 84. Long enough to see Fiona and Xander build one of the most successful ranches in southern Utah and raise 3 strong, independent children. Xander never lost his love of the mountains or his skill as a tracker and lawman, but he no longer needed the solitary life he had once thought essential. He had found something better, richer, more fulfilling than he had imagined possible. He had found partnership with a woman who matched his strength with her own, who built beside him rather than behind him, who loved him with a fierceness that never wavered even during the hard times that inevitably came. There were difficult years. Droughts that killed cattle, harsh winters that tested their endurance, illnesses that frightened them both when they struck their children. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and the bond they had forged in those early days when a corrupt land agent had tried to steal Fiona's dream, and Xander had ridden hundreds of miles to prove the fraud. On their 20th anniversary, Xander took Fiona back to the spot where they had first kissed on her porch steps, the place where he had asked her to marry him. Their children were staying with friends in town, giving them a rare evening alone. They sat together watching the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of crimson and gold, just as they had so many years before. "Do you ever regret it?" Fiona asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Giving up your freedom in the mountains to settle down with me?" Xander laughed, the deep rumbling sound she loved. "Not for a single moment. I did not give up freedom, Fiona. I found it. Real freedom is not being alone in the wilderness. It is choosing to build a life with someone you love, knowing they choose you back every day. I do choose you. Every single day I choose you." She turned to kiss him, and it was as sweet and thrilling as their first kiss had been. "Thank you for riding to the Capitol to prove that fraud." Thank you for believing in me when I had almost stopped believing in myself. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who did not know how good life could be until he met you." Xander pulled her closer, wrapping her in his still powerful arms. "Thank you for building this life with me, for giving me a family, for making every day an adventure worth having." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast desert sky. Two people who had found each other against all odds in the harsh beauty of the American frontier. Around them, their ranch spread out, a testament to courage and hard work and love that had overcome fraud and intimidation and every challenge the wild country could throw at them. Their children grew up strong and confident, Grace becoming a lawyer who specialized in land rights for women and minorities, Jonas taking over the ranch and expanding it further, and Rose becoming a doctor who served the remote communities of southern Utah. All of them inherited their parents' strength and stubbornness, their commitment to justice, and their love for the dramatic landscape that had shaped their family's story. Xander continued working as a marshal until he was 50, then retired to focus full-time on the ranch and his growing brood of grandchildren. He never lost his powerful build or his skill with horses and tracking, though his dark hair went silver and the lines on his face deepened. Fiona remained as beautiful to him at 50 as she had been at 23. Perhaps more so because every line and silver strand represented years they had lived together, challenges they had overcome, joys they had shared. They were known throughout Utah Territory, and later the state of Utah after statehood was granted in 1896, as a couple who had helped shape land reform and fought tirelessly for honest government and justice for ordinary settlers. But to those who knew them best, they were simply Xander and Fiona, the mountain man and the Boston lady who had found love in the Red Rock country and built a legacy that would endure for generations. On summer evenings, when their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for celebrations, people would ask Xander to tell the story of how he and Fiona met. He would settle into his favorite chair on the porch, Fiona beside him with her hand in his, and recount the tale of a corrupt land agent who tried to steal a brave woman's land through forged papers, and the marshal who rode 300 miles to the capital to prove the fraud. But the real story, he would always conclude, his eyes on Fiona's still beautiful face, is not about fraud or justice or even about saving the land. The real story is about finding the person who makes you whole, who turns a house into a home and a piece of desert into paradise. The real story is love, and that is the only story worth telling. Fiona would squeeze his hand and smile, and their children and grandchildren would see the look that passed between them, a look that spoke of decades of love and partnership and choosing each other every single day. It was a look that promised them all that true love existed, that it could overcome any obstacle, and that it was worth fighting for with everything you had. As the sun set over the red rocks of southern Utah, painting the cliffs in the colors of fire and blood and hope, Xander and Fiona Oakes sat together surrounded by the family they had built, the legacy they had created, and the love that had started with a desperate plea for help and grown into something that would echo through generations. They had both come to the frontier searching for something, Fiona for independence and a fresh start, Xander for purpose and a reason to believe in something beyond his solitary existence. What they found was each other, and in finding each other, they discovered that the Wild West offered more than just land and opportunity. It offered the chance to build something lasting with someone who matched your strength and shared your dreams. Their story became part of the history of St. George and the surrounding territory, told and retold as an example of courage in the face of corruption, of justice prevailing over fraud, and most importantly of love finding a way even in the harshest of circumstances. The ranch they built together thrived for over a century, passed down through their children and their children's children, a testament to what two determined people could accomplish when they worked together. Xander lived to the age of 78, dying peacefully in his sleep with Fiona beside him, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had fought so hard to protect. Fiona followed him 2 years later, her last words a whispered promise that she would find him again wherever souls went after this life ended. They were buried together on a hill overlooking their ranch, their graves marked with simple headstones that bore their names and the dates of their lives, and between the dates a single phrase, "Together always." The land that had nearly been stolen through forged papers remained in the Oakes family, a permanent reminder that justice and love could triumph over corruption and greed. The story of how a mountain man rode to the capital and proved the fraud, saving not just a land claim but finding his soulmate in the process, became the foundation story for a family that would go on to shape Utah history through multiple generations. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind blew across the red rocks and the sunset painted the cliffs in impossible colors, people swore they could sometimes see two figures standing on the hill where Xander and Fiona were buried. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair, and a slender woman with her hand in his, looking out over the land they had loved and protected and built into something extraordinary. Whether it was ghost or imagination or simply the power of a love story so strong it left an imprint on the land itself, no one could say. But everyone agreed that if any love deserved to echo through eternity, it was the love between the mountain man and the Boston lady who found each other in the Wild West and built a life that proved love could conquer anything. Their story ended not with separation or sorrow, but with fulfillment and joy, with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their legacy of courage and justice and stubborn determination. It ended with a ranch that thrived and land that remained protected, with reforms that helped countless other settlers avoid the fraud that had nearly destroyed Fiona's dream. But most of all, it ended with proof that love, real love, could transform everything. Xander had ridden to the capital to prove a fraud and save a land claim. But what he really did was save two souls who were meant to find each other, who were meant to build something beautiful and lasting in the harsh beauty of the Utah desert. He proved that sometimes the most important journeys are not about the destination but about who you find along the way. And he proved that love, when it is true and fierce and committed, can overcome any obstacle the world puts in its path. The sun set over the red rocks one final time in this story, casting long shadows across the land that Xander and Fiona had fought for and loved and passed on to their children. And in that fading light their story reached its conclusion, not with an ending but with a legacy, a testament to everything they had built together and the love that had made it all possible. They had found each other in a time of crisis and discovered that what they found was worth more than any land grant, more valuable than any amount of territory, more precious than anything the wild frontier could offer. They found partnership and passion and a love that lasted not just until death but beyond it, woven into the very fabric of the land they had defended and the family they had raised. And so their story closed with satisfaction and peace, with every thread resolved and every promise kept, with a love that had started in fear and desperation and grown into something that would be remembered and celebrated for generations to come. It was the story of the land agent who forged papers on her claim and the mountain man who rode to the capital and proved the fraud. But more than that, it was the story of Xander and Fiona Oakes, who loved each other with everything they had and built a legacy that would never fade. Their happily ever after was not perfect or without struggle, but it was real and lasting and full of the kind of deep, abiding love that transforms both people and places. It was the kind of ending that every love story deserves, where the couple who fought so hard to be together got to spend decades building a life worth fighting for, surrounded by family and purpose and the wild, beautiful land that had brought them together. And when the final sunset came for both of them, they went into it together in spirit, if not in body. Their love story complete and their legacy secure, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carrying forward the values and strength they had demonstrated. They had won not just the legal battle over forged land papers, but something far more important. They had won the right to build a life together, and they had used that right to create something extraordinary. The story of Xander Oakes and Fiona Kendrick ended as all good love stories should, with two people who loved each other fiercely, built something lasting together, and left the world better than they found it. It ended with satisfaction and joy, and the peace that comes from a life well lived in the company of the person you love most. It ended quite simply with happiness.